For parents, a child is everything. Their heartbeat, their breath, their whole world. When you're a Hollywood star, that love burns even brighter than any spotlight. That's why the pain hits so much harder when their child is born with a disability or has to fight illness. Some famous actors have walked away from their careers at the peak of success just to sit by a hospital bed. Others have signed surgery papers with shaking hands, knowing it might be their last goodbye. Some parents have had to say farewell to their children forever. These stories will touch your heart and remind you that even the biggest stars face the same heartbreak as any parent. John Travolta became a household name with his dancing in Saturday Night Fever and his comeback in Pulp Fiction. On screen, he was always winning, but behind the bright lights, he carried a pain that never went away. In 1992, his son Jet was born in Los Angeles. John and his wife Kelly Preston were overjoyed. John once said on television that when he held his newborn son, he knew his whole life would be about protecting this little boy. But Jet's early life was difficult. When he was just 2 years old, doctors found he had Kawasaki disease, a rare condition that can damage the heart and other organs. As he grew, signs of autism appeared, along with severe seizures that kept the family constantly worried. John and Kelly turned their Florida home into a complete therapy center. They had physical therapy rooms, safe play areas, and nurses working around the clock. Kelly said on television that just seeing Jet laugh made all her worries disappear. There were peaceful moments, too. Jet would drive a golf cart with his father in the afternoon sun. He would sit with his mother for hours, coloring pictures or enjoying the beach in the Bahamas. But this peace was fragile. On January 2, 2009, while the family was on vacation, Jet said he needed to use the bathroom. Minutes later, a loud crash broke the silence. When John and hotel staff rushed in, they found Jet unconscious on the bathroom floor. He had hit his head on the bathtub during a violent seizure. Despite being rushed to the hospital, 16-year-old Jet died that morning. John held his son's body close, begging him to open his eyes, but it was too late. Later, John told reporters that when Jet died, part of his soul died too. He said he would trade every award and movie role just to hold his son one more time. Sylvester Stallone faced a similar challenge when his son was diagnosed with severe autism. In 1979, Rocky had made Stallone a Hollywood icon. But his greatest pride wasn't on the movie screen. It was holding his newborn son Sergio in his arms at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Those early years were filled with love. Sergio had soft hair, deep eyes like his father's, and a smile as warm as morning sunshine. Stallone often said that just seeing his son could erase all the stress from filming. Then, concerning signs appeared. Sergio rarely responded when called. He would withdraw to corners, carefully lining up toys in perfect rows, and would pull away from sudden hugs. His wife Sasha thought he was just shy, but calling his name dozens of times with no response planted fear in their hearts. In 1982, doctors at UCLA Medical Center diagnosed Sergio with severe autism. Stallone said later that he had been knocked down hundreds of times in movies, but no blow ever hurt as much as hearing that diagnosis. From that moment, the action hero Rambo began a real-life battle with no applause and no clear enemy to defeat. Stallone reduced his filming schedule and poured all his time, energy, and money into therapy for his son. Every speech exercise, every hour of physical therapy, every new treatment method, he tried them all as if each on. He might be the key to helping his son. The smallest progress became precious. One day, after months of silence, Sergio suddenly called out, "Dad!" Stallone cried right there in the therapy room, not caring who was watching. But there were also heartbreaking moments. Stallone would often watch from a distance as his son looked sadly at other children playing, feeling completely helpless. Friends remembered seeing Stallone leave therapy centers with his shoulders heavy and head down, but he would put on a smile whenever photographers were around. His wife said he kept his pain hidden deep inside because he knew if it escaped, he would never be able to control it again. More than 40 years have passed, and Sergio still needs special care every day. Stallone has never given up this battle. His love isn't loud or dramatic like his movie roles, but it's steady, unbreakable, and stronger than any character he's ever played. Elizabeth Taylor shocked the press in 1961, not for a new role or romance, but but for an image of her in a Munich orphanage holding a tiny baby girl wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. The baby was Maria Burton, just a few months old. From the very first moment, doctors told Elizabeth that Maria was born with hip problems. Without early surgery, those little legs would never work properly, and she would live her life disabled. Elizabeth's husband at the time seemed uncertain, but Elizabeth only held the child tighter, looking deep into her eyes like making a silent promise. She later told reporters that in that moment she didn't think about the illness. She only saw eyes desperately searching for safe arms, and she knew she had to be those arms. On the flight back to Los Angeles, Elizabeth didn't sleep at all. Every soft cry from her daughter made her bend down to kiss her forehead and whisper lullabies through her tears. Passengers never forgot seeing a movie star holding her child so tightly, as if loosening her grip for even a seconds would make her world collapse. Elizabeth's journey as a mother was far from easy. As soon as Maria began to walk, waves of hip pain would strike, causing the little girl to fall to the floor many times. Doctors recommended multiple surgeries. Once, while filming Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth received news that Maria needed immediate surgery. She left the movie set right away, still in costume, rushing to her car with only one thought. She had to be with her child right now. The press often saw Elizabeth leaving film sets in glamorous style, but few witnessed her sitting for hours on cold plastic chairs outside operating rooms, hands clenched until they turned white, eyes fixed on the sign that read, "Operation in Progress." After one surgery that lasted more than 4 hours, Elizabeth walked into the recovery room to find Maria lying still and pale, with tubes everywhere. Elizabeth gently lifted her daughter's tiny hand to her cheek, her voice shaking as she made a promise. "If I had to trade every award, every role, even my career, I would, as long as it means you won't hurt anymore, my Maria." In the following years, Maria learned to walk again slowly, with a limp. But whenever Elizabeth saw her daughter smile as she walked past their garden, she knew she had won the most important award of her life. Robert Redford's story is particularly heartbreaking because of how brief it was. Before he became a Hollywood legend, he was just a 23-year-old newlywed living with his wife Lola in a small New York apartment. They didn't have much money, but they had love and eager anticipation for their first child. On summer evenings in 1959, Robert sat by the window carefully building a wooden cradle for his baby. He chose white paint and sanded every corner and edge, afraid those little hands might get scratched. In September, Scott Anthony Redford was born. Robert remembered clearly the moment his son's tiny hand gripped his finger. A weak grasp, yet strong enough to make him tremble. In that moment, he silently promised to protect his son no matter what happened. But fate had cruel plans. Just weeks later, Scott began showing strange signs. The baby cried in short bursts and breathed rapidly. His eyes would stay shut for hours, as if avoiding the light and world outside. On November 17th, during a bitter cold New York day, Robert was at an audition when the phone rang. On the other end, Lola's voice was broken and torn. "Robert, he's not breathing. They're trying—" He didn't remember leaving the audition, only arriving at the hospital to find the emergency room filled with the smell of antiseptic under harsh white lights. The doctor came out slowly, shaking his head in a way that felt like the closing of an entire world. Scott was gone. The cause was sudden infant death syndrome, an invisible enemy that medicine could barely fight at the time. Robert held his son's already cold body, pressing his cheek against the boy's as if trying to pass his own warmth and breath into him. But it was too late. 2 months. That was all the time Scott had on Earth. 2 months too short for a child to know his father's voice, but long enough to make a man into a father and then take away what was most precious. Years later, at the height of his Hollywood fame, Robert still mentioned Scott in interviews. He once said that there are losses time will never heal. You just learn to live with them like a missing part of your body that always hurts. Jean Tierney was celebrated in 1940s Hollywood as a screen goddess with eyes as deep as an autumn lake and a face so delicate that time itself seemed afraid to touch it. But behind the glamour, she lived with a wound she once said was a life sentence she would never be pardoned from. In 1943, at the peak of her career, Jean married fashion designer Oleg Cassini. Their happiness was complete when she discovered she was pregnant. Nant with their first child. She continued attending charity events during World War II, believing she was doing good by comforting soldiers far from home. One evening at the Hollywood canteen, a long line of fans waited for her autograph. Among them was a young woman with a bright smile but an unsettling look in her eyes. When her turn came, she suddenly hugged Jean and almost proudly said, "I escaped from the German measles quarantine just to meet you." Jean smiled and hugged her back, not knowing that moment had planted a disease in her body that would haunt her forever. Weeks later, she developed fever and a red rash, classic signs of rubella. The doctor warned of high risk to the baby, though he left a small hope. Jean held her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "We'll get through this together, my love." On October 15, 1943, baby Daria was born. But within hours, the doctor delivered devastating news. Daria was born deaf, partially blind, and with severe intellectual disabilities. Jean wrote in her memoir that she couldn't breathe when she heard the diagnosis. Everything blurred around her, and it felt like she had locked the door to her child's life with her own hands. From that moment, every day was a battle with herself. She replayed every detail of that fateful night: the dim lights, the music, the girl's face, the hug, and the words that unknowingly became her child's life sentence. During sleepless nights, she tortured herself thinking, "If only I had stepped back. If only I had refused, my child could have seen the sky and heard the birds." Eventually, Jean made the heartbreaking decision to place Daria in long-term care, calling it the second knife in her heart. Every visit, she held Daria as long as possible, telling her about the deep blue of the ocean, the scent of jasmine at night, and crimson sunsets over Beverly Hills. Daria couldn't hear or fully see, but Jean still spoke and held her as if through love alone she could return the pieces of sky that fate had stolen. She once said through tears, "I made millions of people smile, but I was powerless before my own child's smile." Angie Dickinson's tragedy came much later in life, but was no less devastating. On January 4, 2007, Los Angeles lay under cold, heavy fog. At 2 a.m., a shrill phone ring cut through the stillness. Just 3 words over the line were enough for Angie to know her world had collapsed. Her only daughter, Nikki, would never come home again, not because of an accident or fatal illness, but because the storms in her mind had finally swept her away after 40 years of struggling to survive in a world too harsh for such a fragile soul. In 1966, when Nikki was just a few months old, Angie sensed her daughter was different from other children. She rarely smiled when held, her gaze often drifting into the distance as if lost in a private world no one else could enter. The doctor's diagnosis confirmed what a mother's heart already knew. Nikki had Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism, along with poor eyesight. At that time, Asperger's was barely understood, and beyond medical challenges, Nikki faced suspicious glances and social exclusion. At the height of her career, Angie stepped away from major roles to stay by her daughter's side. She patiently taught her the smallest tasks, tying shoelaces, recognizing colors, speaking full sentences. Each night she read the same thin book over and over, hoping each word would be the thread that pulled her child closer to the outside world. But 40 years passed, and though Nikki grew older, she lived within a closed circle with few friends, often sinking into depression. When Angie heard Nikki was gone, she felt the sky cave in, leaving nothing to hold on to. Speaking to the press, she said only one short sentence that carried a lifetime of heartbreak. "My child was never short of love, only of a world gentle enough for her to live, in." From that moment on, her eyes always held a cold emptiness that time could never fill. Roy Rogers, America's singing cowboy, also experienced profound loss. In 1950, Roy and his wife Dale Evans adopted a tiny baby girl, naming her Robin Elizabeth Rogers. On the day they brought Robin home, they called her God's miracle. Yet that miracle came with heartbreak. Robin was diagnosed with Down syndrome, a condition surrounded by stigma and isolation at the time. Roy and Dale never saw this as a reason to love her less. They held her on stage, featured her in family photos, ignoring whispers that they should hide her to protect their reputation. Dale wrote that they knew her life would be short, but every day with her had to be full of love. Robin had eyes as bright as an autumn sky and a smile that lit up even the darkest room. Each morning, Roy held her close, telling her stories about the lands he had traveled, hoping his words might touch her little heart. When Robin turned 2, severe mumps and pneumonia struck. Her breathing grew shallow, her bright eyes dimmed, and in her parents' helpless arms, she took her last breath. At the burial, Roy stood like a stone statue, gripping his cowboy hat tightly. In front of him was a tiny coffin covered in white flowers, so small it could be held in one's arms. He didn't sing or speak. He couldn't. Only silent tears fell down the face of the man who had made millions smile. These stories show us that behind the glittering world of Hollywood, famous parents face the same heartbreaks, fears, and struggles as any parent dealing with a child's illness or disability. Their fame and fortune couldn't protect them from these challenges, but their love, dedication, and strength in the face of adversity show the true measure of their character. Whether dealing with autism, genetic conditions, sudden illness, or tragic loss, these parents showed that the most important role they ever played was simply being a loving mother or father to their children.